The room smelled like spilled beer and cigarette ash. It was after 2 in the morning, and the party had thinned out. Most people had gone home or passed out on couches. A few musicians still sat around the living room, guitars leaning against the walls, half-empty bottles on the coffee table. The apartment was in West Hollywood, small and cluttered, the kind of place where songwriters crashed when they were still hungry and broke. Someone had put on a Joni Mitchell record, but no one was really listening anymore. Glenn Frey sat on the arm of the couch, his eyes sharp even though he'd been drinking since sundown. He was lean, restless, the kind of person who could sit still but never seemed at ease. His fingers tapped against his knee, keeping time to something only he could hear. Across from him, Jackson Browne leaned back in a chair, his long hair falling over his face, his expression soft and tired. He had been playing something on the piano earlier, something slow and unfinished, and someone had asked him what it was about. He'd said he wasn't sure yet, that it was still coming together. Glenn had laughed. Not a mean laugh, but loud, the kind that made people look over. "That's the problem," Glenn said, and the room got quieter. "You never know what you're trying to say until it's too late." Jackson didn't respond right away. He just looked at Glenn, his face unreadable, then glanced down at his hands. There were other people in the room, but suddenly it felt like there were only two. "What do you mean?" Jackson asked quietly. Glenn leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I mean, you write like you're apologizing, like you're not sure the audience is going to stick around, so you give them everything up front. Every feeling, every doubt. You don't leave anything to the imagination." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "It's too much," Glenn continued. "It's too careful. You're so afraid of being misunderstood that you explain everything. And by the time the song's over, there's nothing left to wonder about." The room was silent now. The record had ended, and no one moved to flip it. Someone coughed, someone shifted in their seat, but no one spoke. Jackson looked at Glenn for a long time. His eyes were steady, but something behind them had changed. He nodded slowly, then stood up. "I'm gonna go," he said. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. He just picked up his jacket and left. Glenn stayed where he was, staring at the spot where Jackson had been sitting. Someone laughed nervously and tried to start a conversation, but it didn't take. The party was over. Glenn Frey and Jackson Browne had been close for years, not the kind of close where they finished each other's sentences or spent every waking moment together, but close enough that it mattered. They had come up in the same scene, the same cluster of songwriters and dreamers who crowded into the Troubadour and stayed up all night talking about music like it was the only thing that mattered. They had played on each other's demos, traded lines, shared stages. Glenn was sharper, quicker, always pushing forward. Jackson was quieter, more internal, always searching for the right word. They respected each other. That was the foundation. Respect. But respect can be fragile. It depends on balance, on both people understanding their place in the relationship. And sometimes, without meaning to, one person shifts the weight. Glenn had been thinking about this for a while, not obsessing over it, but noticing. He had been listening to Jackson's songs, really listening, and something had started to bother him. It wasn't jealousy. Glenn was doing fine. He had just started working with Don Henley, and they were building something new, something that felt like it could go somewhere. But every time he heard one of Jackson's songs, he felt something tighten in his chest, a frustration he couldn't name. Jackson's songs were good. Everyone said so. They were vulnerable, honest, full of feeling. People loved them. But to Glenn, they felt soft, not weak exactly, but too open. Too willing to let the listener in. Glenn believed in holding something back. He believed that a song should make you lean in, make you work for it. Jackson's songs handed you everything on the first listen, and Glenn couldn't shake the feeling that it was a mistake. He didn't plan to say anything, not that night. But the party had gone on too long and the room had gotten too loose, and someone had asked Jackson about his process, and Jackson had answered, thoughtfully, carefully, the way he always did. And Glenn had heard himself laugh, and then the words had come out. He hadn't wanted to hurt Jackson, he just wanted to be honest. He thought Jackson could take it. He thought maybe Jackson even needed to hear it. But honesty, when it's offered without invitation, can feel like something else entirely. Jackson Browne had always been careful with his words, not because he was afraid of them, but because he believed they mattered. He believed that if you were going to say something, it should be true, and if it was true, it should be said in a way that people could understand. He didn't write to impress anyone. He wrote to make sense of things, to take the mess of feelings inside him and turn them into something clear. He knew people thought his songs were sad. He didn't disagree. But they weren't sad for the sake of being sad. They were sad because life was complicated, and love was hard, and people hurt each other even when they didn't mean to. He wasn't trying to explain everything. He was trying to be honest. And if that meant being vulnerable, then so be it. But Glenn's words had landed differently than Glenn probably intended. Jackson had heard the criticism before, from people who didn't know him, from critics who wanted something harder, something more cynical. He could ignore those people. But Glenn wasn't a stranger. Glenn was someone he respected, someone whose opinion mattered, and that made the words cut deeper. Jackson didn't go home that night. He drove around for a while, windows down, the city lights blurring past. He thought about what Glenn had said, about whether it was true, about whether he did give too much, whether his songs were too soft, too careful, too afraid. He didn't come to a conclusion. He just felt tired. When he finally got home, the sun was starting to rise. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall. He didn't cry. He didn't get angry. He just felt the weight of the thing that had broken, quietly, in a room full of people who hadn't even noticed. Glenn didn't call the next day, or the day after that. He told himself it was because he was busy. He and Don were in the studio almost every day, working on new material, building the sound that would eventually become the Eagles. The sessions were intense, focused. There wasn't time to worry about hurt feelings. And besides, Jackson was a professional. He'd get over it. But every now and then, in the middle of a take, Glenn would think about that night, about the look on Jackson's face, about the way the room had gone quiet, and he'd feel something twist in his stomach. He didn't regret what he said, not exactly. He still believed it. But he regretted the way he'd said it, the timing, the audience, the tone. He thought about reaching out, picking up the phone, saying something. But he didn't know what to say. An apology felt too much like taking it back, and he didn't want to do that. An explanation felt too defensive, so he said nothing, and the silence stretched longer. Weeks passed, then months. Glenn and Jackson didn't stop speaking entirely, but the ease was gone. They'd run into each other at shows, at sessions, at mutual friends' houses. They'd nod, say hello, keep it polite. But the warmth was gone, the trust. Jackson kept writing. His songs got quieter, more internal. Some people said they got better. Some said they got sadder. Jackson didn't care much either way. He wasn't writing for them. He was writing because it was the only thing that made sense. Glenn kept building. The Eagles took off faster than anyone expected. The success was huge, overwhelming, and it swallowed everything else. There wasn't time to think about old friendships or late-night arguments. There was only the next album, the next tour, the next city. But sometimes, late at night after a show, Glenn would sit alone in a hotel room and think about Jackson, about the songs he was probably writing, about whether they were still too soft or whether Glenn had been wrong. He never found an answer. He just felt the weight of the distance between them. Years later, someone asked Glenn about Jackson in an interview. The question came out of nowhere, buried in a list of other questions about influences and early days. Glenn paused. He thought about deflecting, about giving a vague answer and moving on. But something made him stop. "Jackson's a great writer," Glenn said slowly. "Always has been. We just saw things differently." The interviewer waited, sensing there was more. Glenn looked down at his hands. "I think I was too hard on him. I don't know if I was wrong, but I was too hard. And I didn't know how to fix it after." The interviewer asked if they were still in touch. Glenn shook his head. "Not really, not like we were." He didn't elaborate. The interview moved on. Jackson heard about the interview secondhand. Someone mentioned it to him at a party, casually, not realizing the weight it carried. Jackson nodded, smiled politely, and changed the subject. But later, when he was alone, he thought about it. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel angry. He just felt sad. Not for himself, but for the thing that had been lost, for the friendship that had ended not with a fight, but with silence. For the way two people could care about each other and still drift apart because neither of them knew how to reach across the gap. He thought about calling Glenn. He even picked up the phone once, but he didn't dial. He told himself it was because too much time had passed, because they were different people now, because whatever had been between them was too far gone to salvage. But the real reason was simpler. He was afraid that Glenn hadn't really changed his mind, afraid that the word still hung in the air between them, sharp and unresolved, afraid that trying to fix it would only make it worse. So he put the phone down, and the silence continued. In 2016, Glenn Frey died. It was sudden, unexpected, the kind of news that hits hard even if you haven't spoken to someone in years. Jackson heard about it on the radio. He pulled over to the side of the road and sat there for a long time staring at nothing. He thought about the last time he'd seen Glenn. It had been at some industry event, years earlier. They'd shaken hands, exchanged pleasantries. Glenn had looked older, tired. Jackson had wanted to say something real, but the moment had passed too quickly. And then Glenn was gone, swept up by other people, other conversations. Jackson had told himself there would be time, that eventually they'd sit down and talk, that eventually the distance would shrink and they'd laugh about the stupid argument that had ended everything. But there hadn't been time, and now there never would be. Jackson didn't go to the funeral. He told himself it was because he didn't want to intrude, because Glenn's family deserved privacy. But the truth was he didn't think he could handle it. Didn't think he could stand in a room full of people who had known Glenn and pretend that everything was okay, that the loss was just professional, that it didn't cut deeper than that. Instead, he stayed home. He sat at the piano and played some of the old songs, the ones they used to play together, back when things were simple. His fingers moved over the keys, slow and careful, and he let himself feel the weight of it all, the friendship, the argument, the silence, the regret. He didn't cry, he just played, and when he finished, he sat there in the quiet, staring at the keys, thinking about all the things he'd never said. There's a photograph from the early days, before the argument, before the distance. It's black and white, grainy, taken at some small club in Los Angeles. Glenn and Jackson are standing side by side, guitars slung over their shoulders, both of them laughing at something off camera. They look young, unguarded, happy. Jackson keeps that photograph in a drawer. He doesn't look at it often, but every now and then when he's going through old things he comes across it. And he stops. And he remembers. He remembers the night of the argument. The way Glenn's words had felt like a punch. The way he'd walked out without looking back. The way the silence had started small and then grown too large to cross. He wonders sometimes what would have happened if he'd stayed. If he'd argued back or asked Glenn to explain or just laughed it off. He wonders if the friendship could have survived if one of them had been willing to bend. but he knows the answer. It's the same answer it's always been. They were both too proud, too sure of themselves, too afraid to admit that maybe they'd made a mistake. And so the silence had won. Jackson still writes songs. Some of them are about loss, some of them are about regret. Some of them are about the way people hurt each other without meaning to, and the way time doesn't fix everything, and the way some things, once broken, stay broken. He doesn't write about Glenn directly. He doesn't need to. The feeling is there, woven into the chords, buried in the lyrics. The ache of something unfinished. The weight of words that were never spoken. People still say his songs are too soft, too vulnerable, too careful. Jackson doesn't argue, he just keeps writing. Because in the end, the only thing he knows how to do is tell the truth, even when it hurts, even when it's too late. And maybe that's enough, or maybe it isn't. He doesn't know anymore. He just knows that late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels heavy, he thinks about Glenn, about the argument, about the silence, about the friendship that ended not with a fight but with distance. And he wishes more than anything that he'd picked up the phone, just once, just to say something, anything, but he didn't. And now Glenn is gone, and the silence is permanent, and all that's left is the music, and the memory of a night when two friends said things they couldn't take back, and the years that followed. Heavy, unresolved, quiet,